Now we've got Congressman Daniel Goldman. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, great to be here with you.
So I know that we have a whole election in front of us, but there are still a lot of concerns right now about the prospect of certification, specifically with regard to the 12th Amendment, with many people believing that Republicans are going to do their best to get a contingent election where it's decided based on House delegations where Republicans have a majority. So I'm going to read a passage here from the 12th Amendment. The person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be the president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. And if no person have such majority, then from the persons having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president. But in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. So is there any worry within the House of Representatives that Republicans will refuse to certify a state, and that will bring the whole number of electors down, and therefore bringing the total number of electoral votes down from 270 to something more within reach for Donald Trump? Is that a worry among those of you in the House?
You hit the nail on the head. I'm very concerned about this. And this is, perhaps the most urgent reason why it's so important for Democrats to win the House, is that whoever wins on Tuesday, the majority will control the House on January 6th, because we get sworn in on January 3rd, not the inauguration on January 20th. So the way you described it is exactly what the concern is. Now, there was an Electoral Count Reform Act that was passed in 2022, in part to correct some things or protect against some things that happened January 6, 2021. But it still leaves a clear pathway for bad actors in the Republican Party to potentially do Donald Trump's bidding and overturn the election. You need a 20% threshold to object to a particular state's electoral votes. That's different from before, when it was literally any person, any individual member could object. Right. But if you have 40% of the Republicans, you get 20% of the House, and that's not a huge number, even just to move into an objection.
Right. I mean, oftentimes we're looking at pretty much unanimity among Republicans, which is far exceeds the 20% threshold of the House that they would need.
Yeah, there were about 2/3 of the Republicans and maybe a quarter of the entire House last time that objected to the certification of the Electoral College. That would be enough to put us into a potential vote. Then it's a majority vote. And if they throw out enough electors so that neither candidate has 270, then, as you point out, under the 12th Amendment, it goes to a contingent election where it's not a one person, one vote. It is by state delegation. So all the members of each state get together, they vote, and then that state determines, whoever wins that vote determines who the state votes for. And as you point out, and it will probably remain the same, the Republicans, in large part because of gerrymandering, have more state delegations than the Democrats do. So I'm very concerned about this, and I believe this is what the little secret plan is that Donald Trump referenced with Mike Johnson at MSG on Sunday, because Donald Trump's been laying the foundation to claim election fraud for many months. And as you point out, they're already talking about all sorts of different issues, different reasons to object to the election, and it hasn't even happened yet.
So now that we've successfully given everybody a panic attack who's watching and listening to this, what's the bulwark against this? What is the House doing to prevent this type of nefarious activity from going forward?
Well, first and foremost, win the majority. So, I mean, I think, a lot of these contingency plans, there is work on them. There are many people in the House and elsewhere outside, expert lawyers who have been spending a lot of time preparing for all sorts of scenarios. But I will tell you, my perspective, being in the House as a member, I am just focused on winning the majority on Tuesday, because that will solve all of these issues and we will not have to deal with them. And that is far and away the best way to do it. And this is going to be really close. Every vote is going to matter. And if there is ever a time when everybody should feel like their vote counts, it is in this election.
Do you feel like it was a mistake to keep the threshold at 20% of the House, knowing the political environment we live in, the extent to which Republicans kind of fall in line, swarm, and blindly accept, whatever edicts are passed down by Donald Trump?
I don't have that much of an issue with threshold. I think that the language of what bases exist in order to decertify a state's certification of their own electoral votes are overbroad. It's not clear what it means, but they're not sufficiently specific to head off a bad faith effort to overturn the election. And that's really where, I mean, I wasn't in Congress at the time, and I know these things are intensively negotiated, and oftentimes you get to the point where it is better to have something than nothing. So I'm not criticizing anyone, but if there's anything that I would change in this Electoral Count Reform Act, it would be to make it much more narrow and specific as to what reasons Congress could actually decertify a state's certification.
Well, if the claims that they bring up to inevitably cry fraud are completely baseless, maybe they've brought these claims to court within their post-election litigation, and they're struck down very much in the same way that happened in 2020 and 2021, then is that enough of a predicate to strike down these objections in Congress based on the Electoral Count Reform Act?
So there are two bases that this act lays out, and one is pretty narrow. The first one is pretty narrow, and it does say effectively, it does say in there that you need to defer to the state or federal courts that have ruled on this. But the second one is perceived a little bit as a catch-all. I don't have it right in front of me, but it's perceived to be a broader statute, or I should say a broader basis that can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And so it's not clear what exactly the restrictions are on Congress's power to decertify.
Okay, well then I guess the most important question is who ultimately adjudicates that claim?
Well, my guess is ultimately the Supreme Court of the United States does. And that should scare everyone just as much.
Let's say if Democrats win the majority and Hakeem Jeffries becomes the speaker, would he be the initial person to adjudicate that claim when it's brought up?
The only way it would go to the courts is if it is successful. In other words, if the decertification is successful,
okay,
and then it will go to the courts. If Hakeem Jeffries is speaker, that means the Democrats are in the majority. And, by the time a state has certified its own electors, I cannot imagine a scenario in which the Democrats vote to decertify a particular state's electoral votes.
No, but I guess the question I'm trying to ask here is these objections are brought up, and they have a basis for their objection. Who immediately adjudicates that objection to determine whether it's valid or not?
The House vote is effectively the adjudication of it. So after you get to the 20% threshold, there will be a vote by the House and the Senate. It's joint session. I believe it's a joint session. And so if there's enough votes to say that it should be decertified because of whatever reason they come up with, that's how we adjudicate in Congress. We vote. Then it will go to the courts.
Okay, and so the only way it goes to the courts is if they hit that 1/5 threshold. Is that how it works?
No, the only way it goes to the courts is if they throw out the state electoral votes, which requires a majority vote. The threshold is just to allow the objection to proceed. Then there will be a vote on the objection. And the only way that there would be litigation is if that objection is successful.
Okay. And so, in theory, to your earlier point, if Democrats have control of the House, then that is the bulwark against this plan succeeding.
100%. That's right.
Okay.
So that's the focus right now for the next 4 days. And then, if necessary, and hopefully it will not be necessary, we'll take the necessary precautions to fight for our free and fair elections, as Democrats do all the time.
Congressman, you're obviously an elected official from New York. New York and California have become focal points for the House because those states have been largely ignored, and that's in large part where Republicans were able to pick off seats to form their majority. What's the state of play right now in New York, from what you've seen while you've been campaigning with frontline and hopeful Democratic colleagues out in that state?
The feeling is pretty good right now. I think in New York, we were taken by surprise in 2022 a little bit. There is no taking us by surprise this time around. There is a extensive operation, coordinated campaign, a lot of money focused on it, and a lot of focus just from members and others who recognize that New York is ground zero in many ways for this election. There are 7 races in New York that could go either way. And obviously the majority in the House right now is 4 for the Republicans. So 2 of those seats are held by Democrats, and 5 of those seats are currently held by Republicans. So there's a lot at play here, and I will tell you that people understand that. There's energy, there's a lot of motivation, and it's a combination of things, that we're focusing on. Obviously, the kind of top of the ticket matters. There's no question about it. But when you look at the most recent Congress with Republicans in control, it was the most ineffective Congress in history. And the Congress before that, with Democrats in control, was perhaps the most consequential and effective in history. And it is just very clear that the Republicans cannot govern. They cannot do the basic work that Congress should do, much less anything else. And so it is incredibly important, I think, for the American people that Democrats have the majority so that we can continue to fight for the people, not for billionaires, not for the large corporations, and not for this extreme right, which has taken over the Republican Party.
Right, and that's not just talking points either. I mean, you look at what Republicans actually passed. These are the 2 houses that had the exact same majority. When Donald Trump came in, he had a majority of Republicans in the House. When Joe Biden was elected, had a majority of Democrats. With the same majorities, Republicans passed a tax cut for millionaires and billionaires. 83% of the benefits overwhelmingly conferred to the wealthiest Americans in this country. When Democrats had control, Inflation Reduction Act, American Rescue Plan, the gun safety law, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, the PACT Act. So, I mean, this, again, all you have to do is look at the actual legislation that was passed, who it benefited, and I think that puts on full display which party is working for who in this country. But, Congressman, you've been focused especially on Project 2025. I know Republicans have been trying to distance themselves from Project 2025, saying that that's not Trump's agenda. What's your reaction to that?
It's preposterous. First of all, much of Project 2025 was already attempted or implemented by Donald Trump. Second of all, the authors of Project 2025 almost entirely worked in Donald Trump's first administration, and many are just talked about as lead senior officials in a potential Trump 2.0. It's called Project 2025. It's not called Project 2029 or Project for the Future. And we've known since early 2021 that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party. This is Donald Trump's efforts. Of course, he's not digging into the details of it. He wouldn't know where to begin. But this is what his effort is, to right the wrongs or right the mistakes that he feels he made in his first administration, when he was not prepared to be president. And then in his mind, he hired too many competent people who put guardrails around him. And those are the people like his chief of staff, like his vice president, like many cabinet secretaries. 40 of 44 senior officials have come out and said, wrote for him and with him, have said he is unfit and unqualified to be president. But what he has been trying to do is map out an agenda and map out a process so that he won't run into those problems. And a big part of Project 2025 is getting rid of the nonpartisan career officials who are the experts who run our government day to day and put in political lackeys, which will absolutely destroy our national security. It will destroy our alliances with democratic countries around the world. It will allow the military to be used against Americans, which is to this point illegal. It will render us very isolated, link us much more with Vladimir Putin and dictators. We will get no intelligence of any value, so our own national security will be hampered, and we will have no diplomatic relations. It is such a massive, and of course, I should mention, which he tried to do the first time, is to weaponize the Department of Justice to prosecute his enemies and his adversaries. And so I think that it's hard to really quantify exactly how destructive Project 2025 would be. And so, one of the things I've been trying to do is just focus on a few issues and dig deep so people understand that if you are going to politicize the entire government, that we will not have a democratic government as we know it.
Right, and I'm so glad you brought up that specific point within Project 2025. These Schedule F employees, we have hundreds of thousands of career civil servants. Only a few thousand are political appointees. But imagine what happens to the DOJ, the IRS, the FCC, all of these agencies where the FBI, where there's no longer career civil servants but rather political appointees. All of a sudden, if you have these bogus claims of fraud, for example, that even Bill Barr called bullshit when he was Trump's own attorney general. Well, now you have people like Jeffrey Clark and John Eastman and Stephen Miller there validating his claims. If that's who staffs the DOJ and the FBI, well, suddenly these bogus claims of fraud will be validated by these people. Imagine what happens if they say that nefarious ballots are being cast in Detroit or Philly or Milwaukee, for example, in these swing states. Imagine what happens in the next election. How do you properly certify an election without votes from the Democratic stronghold? So there's a lot of problems that can come from that part specifically. So I'm glad that you brought that up and raised the alarm about that aspect of Project 2025. With that said, thank you for taking the time today. Thank you for again raising the alarm about these issues in particular. And thank you for the work that you're doing to get colleagues elected from the state of New York.
Thank you. And thank you for highlighting all of this. You are exactly right in your assessment of the dangers and your comparison of Donald Trump's first 2 years versus Joe Biden's first 2 years. And I think that's an excellent comparison that people should pay attention to because that is what's at stake right now. Thanks for having me.